Welcome back to the deep dive, where we deep dive into some complex topics. Today, we're going to be looking at expected utility theory. We've got a bunch of research papers and notes here, and we're going to really try to get to the bottom of how this theory tries to explain how we make decisions, especially when things are uncertain.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful framework. And what I find really interesting is how it applies to so much more than just money or financial decisions.
Yeah.
Really, we're talking about any situation where you have to make a choice and
Yeah.
you don't know for sure what's going to happen, things with uncertain outcomes. Choosing a career path, even something as simple as deciding whether to take an umbrella when you go out.
Right, right. So let's maybe start with some basics. What exactly is this expected utility theory? I'm guessing it has something to do with, like, weighing potential outcomes against how likely they are to happen, right?
Yeah, you're on the right track. Basically, expected utility theory says that when we're making these decisions under uncertainty, we're trying to maximize our expected utility. In a way, we're looking at all the possible results of each choice, each option, and then we're sort of weighing them against how likely we think each outcome is. And then we choose the option that we think will give us the most, well, satisfaction overall or utility on average.
So it's like we're doing this mental calculation, trying to figure out what's going to lead to the best overall outcome, even if we can't be 100% certain what's actually going to happen.
Exactly, exactly. And the interesting thing is this utility that we're supposedly trying to maximize, it's not just about money, right? It can represent anything we value. It can be happiness, it can be health, security, even something like reputation.
That makes a lot of sense. We all want to make decisions that
Mhm.
lead to the best possible outcomes, whatever those might be for each of us personally.
Right, exactly. And that's actually where things get even more interesting because the theory also recognizes that the probabilities we use in these mental calculations, they aren't always objective. They're often shaped by our own personal beliefs, our own
Yeah.
experiences.
So you're saying even if two people are looking at the exact same choices, they might come to different decisions because they have different ideas about how likely each outcome is to actually happen.
Precisely. Expected utility theory takes this into account with something called subjective probabilities.
Okay.
Basically, it's your own personal judgment, your assessment of how likely you think something is. And this can be different from the actual objective probability, if there even is one for a particular event.
Can you give us maybe like a real world example of how this might play out?
Sure. Imagine you're thinking about investing in a brand new tech startup company. You know one of those. The potential returns could be huge, but there's also a very real risk that the company could just completely fail. Now, whether you choose to invest or not, that decision is going to be influenced by your own assessment of how likely that company is to succeed. That might be based on your understanding of the industry, your faith in the founders, or even just, your gut feeling.
So someone who is a little more optimistic, they might be more willing to take that risk, while someone who is more cautious might shy away from it, even if that potential payoff is exactly the same.
Exactly. Our decisions are influenced by our perspectives and our experiences. And then we can add another layer to this. Expected utility theory also brings in this idea that people have different levels of risk tolerance.
Some people are just more comfortable with uncertainty than others.
Exactly. Some people are just naturally what we call risk-averse. They prefer a sure thing over a gamble, even if that gamble has the same expected value. And then you have others who are more risk-seeking. They're willing to gamble. They're looking for that chance of a big win, even if there's a good chance they might end up with nothing.
I can definitely relate to that. I know I'm pretty risk averse when it comes to like financial decisions, but I'm a little more willing to take risks in other areas of my life.
Right, that's a great example. And it highlights that this theory is not just about cold, hard calculations. It's also about how our beliefs, our perceptions, even our personalities play a role in decision making.
This is starting to make a lot of sense, but I'm still not quite clear on how we actually measure this utility thing. It seems kind of intangible.
That's a great question, and that brings us to something called a utility function.
Okay.
It's a mathematical way to represent a person's preferences, basically showing how much satisfaction or utility they get from different outcomes. So think of it like a graph. On one axis, you have different levels of some outcome, like money or happiness, whatever. And on the other axis, you have the corresponding level of utility.
So if that utility function, if that line is steep, that means that person gets a bigger boost in satisfaction from each additional unit of whatever's on that first axis.
Yeah. Exactly. The shape of that curve, that tells us a lot about that person's risk preferences. So, for example, a concave utility function, one that curves downward, indicates that person is risk averse. That's because each additional unit, let's say of money, brings a little bit less extra satisfaction than the unit before it.
So for a risk-averse person, the jump from $100 to $200 is bigger than, say, the jump from $10,000 to
Yeah,
$10,100.
exactly. On the other hand, you have a convex utility function that curves upward. That suggests that person is more risk-seeking. Each extra unit brings more and more satisfaction, so they're more willing to gamble for those potential gains.
This is getting kind of theoretical, but I can see how understanding these concepts could be really useful in the real world.
Absolutely. I mean, expected utility theory has been applied to everything from insurance markets to investment decisions to just understanding consumer behavior in general.
It sounds like it can help us make sense of why people make the choices they do, even if those choices don't always seem totally rational on the surface.
That's right. It gives us a framework for understanding decision making that goes beyond simple logic and really tries to take into account those complexities of human psychology.
This has been really insightful, but are there any limitations to expected utility theory? I mean, do people always actually make decisions this way in this really calculated way?
You're right to be a bit skeptical, I think. No model is perfect,
Mm.
right? No model can fully capture how complex human behavior is, and expected utility theory it definitely has its limitations. One of the main challenges is that, well, people aren't always perfectly rational, right?
Right.
We might make decisions based on emotions or biases, or sometimes just plain irrationality, even if it contradicts what the theory would predict.
So in reality, our decisions are influenced by a lot of things, not just a simple calculation of expected utility.
Exactly. And that's actually what led researchers to develop even more nuanced models. They're building on top of expected utility theory, but they're trying to account for these psychological quirks. They're
Yeah.
trying to better reflect how we actually make decisions as humans.
That makes a lot of sense. So what are some of these other models, and how are they different from that basic expected utility theory?
Well, one really interesting one is called rank-dependent utility theory, or we can just call it RDU for short.
Okay.
What it does is it challenges that assumption that we treat probabilities in a perfectly linear way.
Meaning we don't necessarily see like a 2% probability as being exactly twice as likely as a 1% probability.
Exactly. We might overweight or underweight certain probabilities based on where they fall in a ranking of possible outcomes. So if we think back to that lottery example, someone using RDU might overemphasize that small probability of winning because it's the best outcome, even though it's statistically very unlikely.
So it's acknowledging that how we perceive probability is kind of skewed by our emotions and our psychology.
Exactly. Another model that's quite interesting is prospect theory, and this one dives even deeper into the psychology of decision making.
Well, I've heard of prospect theory. That's one has to do with loss aversion, right?
You got it. Prospect theory says that we as humans are more sensitive to losses than to gains of the same magnitude. So the pain of losing $100 is often felt more strongly than the pleasure of gaining $100, even though objectively the amounts are the same.
That makes sense. I can definitely relate to that feeling of not wanting to lose something. It explains why we might hesitate to take risks, even if the rewards could be really big.
Exactly. Loss aversion is a powerful motivator, and prospect theory incorporates that into its framework. And it also takes into account other psychological factors, like framing effects. That refers to how the way choices are presented, how they're framed, can actually influence our decisions.
So it's not just about the actual outcomes, but also about how we perceive or how they're described to us.
Precisely. A classic example is how people respond differently to a medical treatment that has a 90% survival rate versus one that has a 10% mortality rate. Logically, those outcomes are the same, but how it's framed affects our perception and ultimately our choice.
This is really making me think about how I approach my own decisions. It seems like our emotions and our perceptions play a much bigger role than we might realize.
That's one of the key insights that these newer models are bringing to light. They're challenging that traditional view of humans as perfectly rational actors, and they're embracing the fact that we are influenced by our psychology, by our biases, and by our heuristics.
This has been really incredible so far. We've talked about a lot, from expected utility to RDU and prospect theory, and it's clear that decision-making is a pretty complex process. But before we move on, can we talk a little bit more about how these theories actually play out in the real world? I'm really curious to hear some examples that bring these concepts to life.
Absolutely. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore some really interesting case studies that show how these theories are being applied in different fields like healthcare, finance, and even environmental policy.
I'm really looking forward to that. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into this fascinating world of decision-making,
Welcome back to our deep dive on decision-making under uncertainty.
where we've been trying to untangle how theories like expected utility and all those, rank-dependent utility, prospect theory, how they help us understand the amazing ways our minds work.
And how all those mental processes actually translate into the choices we make every single day.
You left us with a big question last time. How can we use all this knowledge, all this theoretical stuff, to make better decisions in our own lives?
It's the core of why we study this, right? And I think the key here is developing a deeper understanding of all those factors that are influencing our decisions.
So, like becoming more aware of our own tendencies and biases.
Exactly. Once we can identify our own patterns, whether it's risk aversion or loss aversion or how we weight probabilities, we can actually start making more informed choices that align with our goals.
Okay, that sounds great in theory, but how would we actually do that? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Absolutely. Let's start with that risk aversion idea. If you know that you tend to be risk averse, you can actually adjust your decision making to take that into account.
So, like, if I'm offered a risky investment, something with a really high potential payoff, but I know I'm risk averse, I should probably think about the downside a lot, right? Before I just jump in.
Precisely. Don't let those big potential gains blind you to the potential losses. If you're risk averse, you might be better off diversifying your portfolio, choosing lower risk investments that you feel more comfortable with.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about loss aversion? How do we apply that knowledge to everyday decisions? Because I feel like I experience that all the time.
Loss aversion really comes down to understanding how losses make us feel, the emotional impact. Because we know losses feel bigger in our minds than gains, right? So being mindful of that is important. Think about the last time you were haggling over a price, maybe at a store or something.
Oh, yeah, at that flea market last month.
Exactly. Well, if you frame the negotiation in terms of what you'll lose if you don't get your price, you might be more motivated to push for a better deal.
Have to try that next time. I feel like I give in too easily sometimes.
It's a common thing. It happens. Another thing you can do to counter that loss aversion is to focus on the bigger picture.
You mean, like, don't sweat the small stuff, focus on the overall gains.
Exactly. Sometimes we get so fixated on these small losses, and it really throws off our decision-making. By shifting our perspective, focusing on those net gains, we can make choices that are more rational.
It's a good reminder to keep things in perspective. Okay, how about probability weighting? How does understanding that help us?
Probability weighting is all about understanding how our perceptions of probability can get distorted. Remember, we tend to overweight those small probabilities and underweight the large ones.
Like that lottery example.
Yeah.
I still feel like I could win sometimes, even though I know the odds are, like, super slim.
Exactly. That's how that probability weighting works. We overestimate our chances because we're focused on that big payoff, even if it's statistically unlikely.
So how do we not fall into that trap?
One way is to really try to de-bias our thinking. Whenever you're making a decision that involves probabilities, try to take a step back, really try to look at those probabilities objectively.
So instead of letting my emotions run wild with lottery dreams, I should look at the actual odds and try to be more rational.
Precisely. Another good strategy is to consider a whole range of outcomes instead of just focusing on the best case or worst case scenario.
So don't just think about winning the lottery or losing everything, but consider all the possibilities in between.
Exactly. When you look at a wider range of outcomes, you get a much more realistic picture, and that helps you make a more informed choice.
These are really helpful tips. So it sounds like the key to applying all these theories is to become more aware of our own thought processes and then use that awareness to make better, more conscious choices.
You've got it. It's about understanding your own mind and then using that knowledge to your advantage.
I'm really starting to see how powerful these theories can be, not just for understanding how decisions are made, but for actual self-improvement.
And remember, this isn't about turning into some emotionless robot. These theories, they don't erase our emotions or our biases. They just help us understand them so we can make choices that truly align with what we want, with our values and our goals.
Right, it's about making decisions that are more, like, authentically our own.
Exactly. And while we've been talking about individuals, how they can use this, these theories also have big implications for society as a whole.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. What kind of implications?
Well, for one thing, they help us understand, maybe even predict, how people behave in different contexts, like in consumer markets or financial markets.
So if we know most people are loss averse, we could design products or marketing that taps into that, right?
Exactly. Or if we understand how people perceive probabilities, we can use that to make policies that encourage people to make better choices, choices that are good for them.
That's fascinating. So it's like using this knowledge to design systems and environments that help people make better decisions.
Exactly. Behavioral economics, which is based on these theories, is being used more and more in fields like public policy, healthcare, and even environmental protection.
So it's not just about individual choices, but about how we can shape the choices of whole populations.
Precisely. By understanding those psychological factors, we can create systems that really promote well-being for everyone.
This is really inspiring. It gives me hope that we can actually use this knowledge to make the world a better place.
I'm with you. I'm optimistic too. By understanding human decision-making in a more nuanced way, we can move beyond those really simplistic models of pure rationality and actually build a more just and equitable society.
I want to hear more about how these theories are being used for those big challenges, but before we get too far ahead, can we go back to those limitations we talked about earlier?
You're right. It's good to keep those in mind. No theory is perfect, and these models, they definitely have some shortcomings.
So, like, what are the biggest ones?
One of them is that they often rely on these simplified assumptions about how people behave.
Like the idea that people always act in their own self-interest, or that they have perfect information about the choices they're facing.
Exactly. In the real world, our decisions are affected by so many things: social norms, cultural values, even just our mood at the moment. Things that are hard to measure and predict.
So these models might not always be accurate, especially in those messy, unpredictable situations we encounter all the time.
That's right. And another limitation is that a lot of these theories come from studies in controlled lab environments.
So the results might not hold up in the real world.
Exactly. It's tough to take findings from a lab setting and apply them to the real world.
So even though these theories are really insightful, we shouldn't take them as absolute truth or assume they can explain everything about how we make decisions.
I agree. It's important to be a little skeptical, right? And always be aware of those limitations when applying these theories to real-world problems. That's why we're taking this deep dive in the first place.
This has been so insightful. We've covered so much ground, from the theory to the practical applications. It's clear that decision-making is a really complex process.
And I think we've laid the groundwork to look at some specific examples of how these theories work in the real world.
I'm excited to explore those examples. Let's continue this journey in the next part of our deep dive into decision-making. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into decision-making. We've talked a lot about the theories, but now I'm ready to see how they actually work in the real world.
It's one thing to understand the ideas, but it's way more interesting to see how they influence what people actually do.
Exactly. Let's get into those real-world examples you mentioned.
All right, well, one area where these theories have been used a lot is in health.
Oh, wow, I wouldn't have thought of that right away. How do they fit in with health decisions?
Well, think about it. When people are making choices about medical treatments, they're weighing risks and benefits, just like with any other decision.
Right, like choosing between different treatments, each with its own chance of working and its own risks.
Exactly. Imagine a patient has to decide between surgery, which might have a high chance of success but comes with big risks, versus a less invasive treatment that's less likely to work but has fewer side effects.
That's a tough one. How do these theories help us understand what the patient might choose?
Well, expected utility theory would say the patient has to weigh those potential outcomes, successful surgery or less successful treatment, against how likely each one is.
So someone who's really risk-averse, they might go for the less invasive option, even if it's less likely to work, just to avoid those complications.
That happens all the time, but it's not just about avoiding risk. Loss aversion plays a role too.
Meaning they might be more worried about something bad happening, like the surgery failing, than about getting better.
Exactly. And that can make people make choices that don't seem rational if you just look at the numbers.
So they might choose the treatment that feels safer, even if it means missing out on a chance for a better outcome.
You got it. And we can't forget about probability weighting. Patients might overestimate how likely rare side effects are, or underestimate the long-term benefits of a treatment, especially if those benefits are way in the future.
It's like those framing effects, right? How information is presented can really change how we see risk and probability.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important for doctors to really communicate clearly with their patients, not just about the facts, but about the risks and benefits too. It's all about helping patients make choices that are right for them.
This is really interesting. It shows how we can use these theories to help people with these tough medical decisions. It's making me think about how I would approach those situations differently.
I'm glad to hear that. And it's not just about individual choices. These theories can also help shape public health programs and interventions.
Oh, wow. Can you give me an example?
Sure, think about those campaigns that encourage people to get vaccinated or to get screened for diseases.
How would these theories apply there?
Well, we know that people are often loss averse, right? So
Yeah.
we can design these campaigns to highlight what people might lose if they don't get vaccinated or screened.
So instead of just focusing on the good things about prevention, we also talk about the bad things that could happen if you don't do it.
Exactly. That can be a better way to get people to act, especially those who are really worried about risks. We see it in ads all the time.
That's a great point. It shows how we can use these theories to make public health campaigns more effective.
And it's not just health. These theories are being used for environmental issues too.
Really? How does that work?
Think about things like trying to get people to reduce their carbon footprint or save energy. Those are decisions with long-term effects, just like health choices.
Right, I see the connection. But how do the theories fit in?
Well, loss aversion is a big one here too.
Yeah.
We can focus on the potential losses if people don't act, like how much climate change could cost or the health problems caused by pollution.
So we appeal to people's desire to avoid those bad outcomes, not just their desire to be environmentally friendly.
Exactly. And probability weighting comes into play as well. People might underestimate the risks of climate change because those risks seem so far off in the future.
So we need to make those risks feel more real and urgent.
Precisely. By explaining those risks in a way that makes sense to people, given how they perceive probability, we can get them to act.
These examples are amazing. They show how these theories can be used to tackle really big problems.
It shows how powerful behavioral economics can be, how we can use it to make a real difference.
I'm blown away by how much we can do with these theories. As we wrap up, what are your final thoughts on what we've learned? What does it all mean for how we understand decision-making?
I think the big takeaway is that human decisions are way more complex than we used to think. It's not just about logic and being rational.
We're not just robots calculating everything, right?
Yeah.
Our emotions, our biases, how we see things, it all matters.
Exactly. And while those things can sometimes lead us to make bad decisions, they're also what make us human. They're what allow us to be creative and empathetic and intuitive.
It's about accepting that our decisions are complicated and learning how to work with that.
I agree. The more we understand what influences our choices, the better we can become at making decisions and the better we can make the world. It's about using this knowledge to help ourselves and others.
That's a great point to end on. This deep dive has been incredible. It's made me really rethink how I see decisions and how much these theories can teach us about being human.
I'm glad you found it helpful. And remember, we're always learning when it comes to making decisions. By continuing to explore these theories and using what we learn, we can all make better choices that lead to a happier, more fulfilling future.
Thank you so much for taking us on this journey. I feel like I have a whole new way of thinking about decisions now.
It was my pleasure. Remember, every decision is a chance to learn and grow. Keep exploring and keep making those choices with purpose.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dives. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of decision-making. Keep those minds curious, and we'll see you on the next one.